Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last Rareminds podcast of 2025. As I sit here on this rather damp and chilly December morning, I think perhaps our topic for today is going to be quite timely. So we're going to be talking today about fatigue and exhaustion, which we know is a really ubiquitous issue across so many living with rare conditions. 53% of those who use our counselling services cite fatigue as a real problem, and a 2022 report into those issues that affect those with rare conditions cited fatigue and exhaustion as a significant underrepresented, under-acknowledged and under-resourced problem for our community. So I'm really delighted to be meeting Jess Hobart today from Mastocytosis UK. And we're going to be talking together about how fatigue and exhaustion impacts her community, but also about fatigue and exhaustion more generally, and begin to think about ways of addressing that, partly in preparation for a new section on our wellbeing hub that addresses fatigue and exhaustion across rare diseases more generally. So welcome, Jess. Thank you so much for making time at what I know is a really busy and tiring time of year for a lot of people. So Jess, could you perhaps tell me a little bit about how fatigue and exhaustion is impacting your community and how they are living with it and finding their way with it?
Absolutely. So we help people with mast cell diseases, mastocytosis, but also mast cell activation syndrome and hereditary alpha tryptosemia. And mast cells are these lovely little kind of bags of chemicals. They are part of the immune system, but they release all kinds of chemical mediators to respond to various things that the body might encounter. And some of those mediators have a very fatiguing effect on the body when they're released. And so people with mast cell diseases can really struggle with fatigue. And in the last week before we met, I asked people in our community how they describe their fatigue. And, people talked about, walking in treacle. They talked about hitting a wall. They talked about just feeling foggy and unable to open their eyes in the morning. And fatigue can be kind of combined with other neurocognitive symptoms. So sometimes it's a little hard to disaggregate and say, this is fatigue and this is a problem with cognition and word finding and, all of those things. But people, one of the things that people describe that can be really challenging is that it is transient for some people. Some people it's all the time. But for some people, they're okay and they look okay to other people one time, in the day. And then an hour later, they feel absolutely terrible and can't function. And so it's very hard when things are unpredictable. It's hard to be able to make plans and to interact with people. And sometimes people can identify reasons why they are feeling the way that they are feeling. Something set them off. And sometimes it's just that's, the trigger isn't clear. And also, it's just constant. So it does vary quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think that's probably a sort of an experience others with other rare conditions will recognise too. Sometimes you can be living with fatigue in a more chronic way, but often it's the unpredictability of when you're going to be hit by a wave of fatigue and how long it's going to last that is as much a troubling and frustrating aspect of living with it. And I think the complicating thing about fatigue as well is that we don't have a sort of a clear definition of what it is, and it's not visible.
Yeah.
So I was talking to someone recently who's quite young, and he was saying it's really frustrating for him because he can be absolutely felled by fatigue almost sort of overnight and unpredictably.
Yeah.
But he looks quite okay on the outside, and it's that invisible aspect I think that's really hard too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people can't tell if you're having a good day or a bad day, and you have to talk about it, and which can also be very difficult. I was talking yesterday actually with a physical therapist who works with people who have cancer fatigue. and she's done a little bit of long COVID. And she said, I try to distinguish fatigue from tiredness by thinking, does sleep help you?
Mm.
That was in her community. That's a way of distinguishing those things. And I think there are ways in which that distinction is helpful and ways in which it isn't. Because, when I ask my community, what do you do when you feel fatigued? Some of them say, I go to bed for 3 hours and then I'm pretty okay afterward.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't that they were tired from a bad night's sleep. I mean, they might have been tired from a bad night's sleep, but
Yeah.
it was that they were hit by these chemical mediators that made them feel terrible. And in 3 hours, they've passed, and giving their body rest and removal from whatever that trigger was has made them feel better. So I'm not totally sold on the if sleep fixes it, it's tiredness versus fatigue. But
Mm.
I thought that was an interesting distinction. I do think it can be helpful to kind of disaggregate, is there a piece of this that's about my sleep habits?
Mm.
And are there things that I can do? I mean, sometimes we sleep poorly because our disease just doesn't let us do it. And, there's nothing we can change. But sometimes there are things, having a regular bedtime and leaving your phone outside, all the sort of typical sleep hygiene recommendations.
Mm.
Sometimes that does help. Sometimes timing your medications better so that, if they make you sleepy, they make you sleepy at the right time, can help so that you do at least get the best sleep that you can. But that's just a starting point. And that's never the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember someone describing their fatigue to me, and they're saying it's like a different order of tiredness. It's sort of tiredness plus plus. It goes beyond something. And I remember relating to it a bit like when I first had a baby and I spoke to colleagues who hadn't had children, and they would tell me they were tired. And I was like, you have no idea what tiredness is. This is like completely different order of something.
Yeah.
And I think there's something similar with that, with fatigue. It goes beyond an ordinary tiredness. You're felled by something in a particular way. We sometimes make a distinction between fatigue and exhaustion in Rare Minds. And I don't know if that's helpful or not. It's an open question, really. We sometimes think of fatigue as being something that's more organic or biological to do with your rare condition. So we tend to apply it more for people who are living with a rare condition as an affected person. And then we use exhaustion to describe the experience perhaps of carers or those looking after them, which is another sort of order of fatigue. But how do you kind of think about them a little differently? Because they might both need related but slightly different approaches too. Is that come up in your community too?
Absolutely. Yes. I was speaking with our trustees, and some of them are parents with affected children. And they said, don't forget us.
Yeah.
We, it's quite common for children with mast cell diseases to have interrupted sleep. A lot of them experience itching or bone pain. And that often happens at night. And so these parents are often up through the night, trying to share the load, but also working and managing all of the things that parents normally do. And then you add in the mental load of worrying about your child, advocating for them in a healthcare setting or in an educational setting. And that exhaustion, I think, is really amplified. But I think it is helpful probably to think about those things separately. But also to say, for patients, there's the fatigue, the biological fatigue aspect of the disease, but there's also the exhaustion sometimes of having to do the advocacy.
Yeah.
Adults often also need carers when, with mast cell diseases. So some of that is sometimes borne by a carer, but the patients are also on guard a lot. And I think that kind of vigilance, the constant vigilance, can be completely exhausting as well.
Yeah.
When, is somebody, in my case, I get triggered by people's scents that they wear. So perfumes, colognes, vape, mist, whatever you call that stuff, smoke. I was at a Christmas fair, and the glue vine, the hot wine that is wafting alcohol into the air was setting me off as well. And so, everything you sort of on guard, looking around, trying to keep yourself safe.
And that brings me to another aspect, I think, which is so challenging in terms of living with fatigue, is that how you manage your life and make decisions around things that might mitigate your fatigue, but bring up other perhaps difficult feelings or challenging decisions in their own right, because you might be missing out in some way. I was thinking of your example, you're at this fair, it should be a lovely thing, but then you have to take yourself out of that situation, I imagine, in order to look after yourself in another sort of way. And that's enormously impactful on mental well-being, I think, too. So that emotional impact of living with fatigue.
The emotional impact, it's certainly multifaceted. I mean, one is unpredictability affects social relationships. And so if you're the unreliable friend, people stop inviting you to things. I'm the person who writes to my book club and says, just a reminder, please don't wear perfume when we're going to the pub for our Christmas gathering. And that feels really awkward, and advocating for yourself in those circumstances can make people feel pretty uncomfortable. And so sometimes people just don't do it. And it, even when I do it, it feels awkward. I think the kinds of changes that we make can feel like, they feel like losses. Right? People make decisions about workplaces and their ability to work. Fatigue can remove them entirely from being able to work, or make them work at home, it can be isolating. And I think they also may mourn because some of the things that they need to give up in order to feel better are the things that bring us pleasure. Whether it's somebody has an issue with chocolate, alcohol for a lot of people is a trigger. I sort of laughingly say, I haven't had a bath in 25 years because baths make me feel terrible. I have to go to bed for 3 hours. So I don't have access to that, soothing choice. And I think there's, there's some grieving that we need to do, but it's not that we grieve these things once and then we're done with it. But I think if we don't grieve it, it also can make things harder going forward as well.
And dealing with those or facing those really difficult feelings is another aspect of managing fatigue, isn't it? But I think you're absolutely right. Unless we can face those feelings, we can sometimes fall into that trap of trying to ignore the fatigue or push through it, or just live in a state of perpetual frustration that it's an aspect of our life, rather than trying to sort of grit your teeth and find ways through it, of managing it, of mitigating it. It's hard to kind of message your book group and say, look, please don't wear perfume, because I imagine a part of you's like, I don't want to be known as that person with the rare condition who's always foregrounding some aspect of it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a really tricky balances at work with this, I think.
I agree. And, one of the skills that we want to build in people in our communities is this ability to advocate for their needs, because there all are these environmental things that can affect people, and because they may need help at some point, and people need to know that they might need emergency help. And I do think, having worked with people with mast cell diseases in the US and also here in the UK, I've been here a long time, even though I don't sound like I have. I think UK folks maybe need extra encouragement to speak up.
That's interesting. You think we're more reticent over here somehow. There's a little bit of a difference there.
Yeah, I think people are anxious about rocking the boat. I think there's a bit more of an inclination to tolerate discomfort, which in some contexts is a a great cultural feature, but in this particular setting, it can lead then to a snowballing of circumstances that then removes the person because they then say, oh, I can't go to the pub because I'm not, because it will make me feel bad.
Yeah. I wonder if it's an extension of that sort of, the British cliche of the stiff upper lip. It's better to sort of, keep calm and carry on, But of course, in doing that, there might be real costs, or you might just absent yourself when you don't need to. Yeah. Often in Rare Minds, we sort of take the position of you can't control how other people will respond to what you disclose about yourself. Yeah. But you might be pleasantly surprised. And if you don't try, you won't know. Yeah. And if you get a negative response, well, that can inform how you navigate that situation with that individual or organisation in the future. But it's always worth trying to see what you can negotiate. And not being apologetic, I think, is a very sort of maybe it's a very English thing again, of sort of apologising for, oh, I'm sorry, but, and yet it's not a choice. It's not something that, you're not choosing to be seen to be difficult in some way.
Yeah. It is tempting. And I know I apologize. But I also just say it most of the time. If I'm going to somebody's house and I need to make sure there's food that I can eat, I offer to bring something and also help them devise something that might work for me. But I do apologize when there's an added burden, I think, where I feel like somebody's having to do something extra special.
Yeah. I sometimes use the phrase, really what we're doing is we're allowing the other person to feel good about themselves by being able to offer some help or support in some way. Just slightly reframe it.
I like that framing. I think that's helpful. I think the piece of it, when I'm thinking with people in our community, I try to I think about it in 3 steps. Sort of, is there anything I can actually change about my circumstance that might affect my fatigue? So, can you and your doctor tweak your medications? Can you change when you take them? Can you change what you're being exposed to? Is there a way to not have as many of these chemicals being released?
Yeah.
Or, not have them have as much of an effect on the body by having medications that help a little bit with that. And, can you work on your sleep? Can you work on your stress level? So for us, the added thing about stress is that stress hormones go directly to mast cells. If they encounter them, they make them release all these chemicals. So there's something called corticotropin releasing hormone, and that's a major trigger of mast cells. So if you don't have your stress strategies that you turn to when things get tough, you're more likely to have that have a physiological effect on you that is longer lasting. And so, developing those skills so that you are able to notice what's happening in your body when you start to feel stress and then turn that down. But of course, not everybody with a rare disease is in a position to tweak anything that will affect their fatigue. And, and many of our members have tried everything, are doing the best they can with all of that stuff, and they still feel completely rubbish. And then, it's, how do I adjust my expectations? That's sort of the next stage. How do you adjust what the people around you think you can do and what you think you can do, be able to, live as fully as you can. And then how do you manage the feelings about that is sort of the third piece of it.
Yeah. I think that's a really helpful reminder that when we're thinking about addressing fatigue, it's not one thing. There might be sort of biological approaches or medication or tweaking your diet or what you're exposed to that may make a difference on one level. There's looking at your sleep. How can you optimize that? There's managing your stress. And then there's thinking about the sort of practical implications, what you can negotiate in your social life or your work life to sort of optimize what energy you have. One of the things that we've also picked up through our work in Rare Minds, but I'm interested to know how it affects the mast cell disease community, is healthcare professionals often acknowledge fatigue as a feature of a rare condition, but it doesn't go much beyond necessarily a kind of acknowledgement. Yes, you might expect fatigue as part of da, 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 da.
Yeah.
But then there isn't always a lot of signposting or any signposting perhaps to strategies that are out there on the internet, even if it's not talking directly to a psychologist or being referred to a fatigue management program. Is that something you see in the mast cell community around how healthcare professionals kind of approach fatigue, or is it different for yourselves? Or
I think it depends to an extent who you're talking to. So we have a really heterogeneous community, and there are some people who sort of automatically get fed into certain systems. So if you have an advanced form of systemic mastocytosis, which is a circumstance where you have a proliferation of mast cells that is starting to affect things like your liver and your spleen and your blood counts, you might feed right into Macmillan.
Okay.
And so there are cancer-related programs around fatigue that some of our patients do get fed into because they appropriately fit into that category. But as soon as you step away from that particular group, I can't think of a single patient who has been referred to a program, particularly around fatigue. Now, some do get some referrals to stress management or mindfulness programs, which actually can be really helpful. And I wish more got that kind of referral, because we've really seen that for some people that can be really transformative. And of course, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, we can be hesitant to acknowledge the link between the things where we can do something about the way we feel, and things where we can't, because it's risky to say, well, am I bringing this on myself, right? If I say, that I can avoid these things, should I just avoid all of them? And I think, and there's a piece also where people can be hesitant to accept psychological support, and this is sort of falls in the category because it's not all in their head, right? And they have this strong feeling, like you're saying, if I get my head together, then my body should be together too. And they want to make sure, especially people who have been on a long journey to get a diagnosis or still on the journey to get a diagnosis, where they can be hesitant to accept the psychological support because they feel like it's then negating their need, or they might be seen as not worthy of more attention about the physical things that are going on.
Yeah. I think it's a really complicating factor, and it's one of the things why Rare Minds came into existence, really, because I think so many in our community have had really bruising experiences with either healthcare professionals or mental health care professionals, where neither understand perhaps the impact of the rare condition, or perhaps mental health, physical healthcare professionals don't also understand perhaps the impact of things they're saying, or just that kind of the emotional burden and challenges of living with a rare condition in the widest sense. So physical and mental health services don't necessarily relate to each other terribly well, I think, and there's a lot of work to do in that area more generally. But I was thinking too around how there is such a strong kind of cultural imperative at the moment that you are valued if you're busy. There is also almost a sort of a valuing of exhaustion. And I was reading a really interesting book a while ago, and they were talking about how back in the 16th century, it was kind of really taboo to say that you were really busy. It would be seen as kind of quite shocking and a bit sort of, why would you be so busy? Yeah. The idea was that rest was valued. The idea that you had nothing to do that day was like, oh, how marvelous, tell me more about how you're spending your time. But we've so overprivileged a kind of busyness that rest or stepping back is treated almost a bit suspiciously, and yet it's so necessary and so ordinary.
Yeah.
Now, if you're living with fatigue, you have to get good at doing that, but it's a truly countercultural, slightly subversive thing to do, actually.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the whole productivity culture, everybody, how can I maximize everything? And in fact, some of the stuff we talk about, even with sleep, right? People are taking the sleep hygiene thing to an extreme as well, because everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people are talking about optimizing, right?
Yeah.
And for us, optimizing means a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And we do want to make the most of the good times when we're feeling well, do the things that are most important to us, whatever they are. But it certainly helps if some of what we do is to optimize our connections to other people rather than our to-do list. Because, for overall well-being, we certainly need those relationships.
Yeah. And I think that's perhaps where fatigue is both challenging but an opportunity to really reflect on what is important to you in your life. Where do you quite literally put your energy, however much energy you have? And sometimes that involves really difficult decision making and grappling with parts of ourselves that we might not always be very comfortable with too, around what we might really want to do and what we don't really want to do. Perhaps feel we should or we have to. So it can bring up all sorts of very conflictual and contradictory feelings when we think just about, managing fatigue and making those choices about where to put our energy. You were smiling as I said that, and I felt like you sort of went, yeah, that's true.
I just was thinking, because we all exist as part of a social ecosystem, other people may have other ideas about how that should be optimized, and then you need to, that requires a negotiation and and a figuring it all out together.
Absolutely. And I think going back to what you were saying too around how perhaps mental health care professionals might have more traditionally approached fatigue in a sort of, well, you need to do this and this and this and this. It can be a little bit rigid. Yeah. Reminded me when I was talking to someone, so they have to follow quite a restricted diet. Otherwise, there are a lot of side effects on their digestive system, which include pain and fatigue. And they were saying as part of their management of their condition, sort of to support their mental well-being, actually, sometimes they make a choice to eat the things they know will be problematic for them because they love them. And it's part of being in a social group or a social setting at a particular time. So they plan for when they know they're going to be saying, yes, I'm making a conscious decision. I'm going to eat in this way at this particular time. And then I manage the consequences of that. Yeah. Because it's worth it to them. There might be another point in their life when it's not worth it to them. But right now, that's the point where they're saying, actually, this is more important for my emotional well-being, and not feeling totally in thrall of the condition, if you like. Being able to make choices in the face of it. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, we in fact had a conversation about that in our community just over the last few days, talking about, we are adults and we can choose sometimes to do things that we know will have consequences. I think the trick for us is, and as an advocate, I always have to be careful about that. People can have anaphylaxis. So I can't say to somebody, hey, go ahead and,
Yeah.
do that thing that is going to cause anaphylaxis. But there are a lot of stages that come before that. And, and you and your doctor and can think about how much tolerance there is for you about a particular thing. I find that I do pretty well with exercise in the right circumstances. And I am 56, but I talked my way into a class for over 65s, which suits me beautifully because I can do, I'm surrounded by people who have reasons to be a little careful with their bodies. Nobody's telling me I should be competing with anybody. And I can just do it at whatever the level is that's appropriate. And every now and again, I push it a little too hard, and then I have to take a couple hours and recover because my body says, "Oh my God, really, that was unnecessary." And I think, well, maybe, but my muscles feel stronger and my bones are stronger because we have osteoporosis and in mastocytosis, and we need to be doing some of these things that push a little bit.
Yeah, but you're finding a way to pace yourself, and the pace of that class is going to suit you much better than if you're going into an ordinary exercise class where you'll be being encouraged to push it harder all the time, and that would be counterproductive.
And it would be tempting, right? I would be tempted to want to comply because I like to be coached, and if somebody says you lift something that's heavier, okay. So for me, this is a way to to push it a little, but not too much. And I think it's important for us to be able to communicate about the choices that we're making around us, right? Somebody might say, well, why did you have, half a beer last night? Alcohol, often a trigger. Well, why did you do that? Now you feel terrible. It's like, yeah, well, other people are hungover too. It's just mine is a little different. Normal people without this kind of challenge. I don't like using that word, but people who don't have to make decisions because of their disease state make these kinds of choices all the time, right? About how they use their energy. It's just, the calibration is different.
Yes, but you're bringing our attention to how we sometimes have to manage other people's opinions about our decision making too. And I know many people say, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about how you should live with a rare condition when you don't have one. That's that's another aspect of it. But I think you're absolutely right that it's very individual what's going to work for you, what you can tolerate, how you find a way of managing and coping with how your particular fatigue impacts and manifests for you. And we're all different in that regard. We'll all make different choices, and different things will speak to us and resonate with us. You mentioned mindfulness, and I completely agree. In Rareminds, we often run a pain and fatigue mindfulness program, which I think is hugely helpful for many people. But for other people, they might go, "Oh, it's just not for me. I'm not sure I want to do mindfulness." So that you have to find your way to other strategies, other things that you think, yeah, I can go with that. That makes sense to me. We talk about things like pacing or spoon theory, and back to that, we're all different. What we feel we can roll with, what's going to work for us, we have to find our way to sometimes over time as well, because not everything is necessarily going to work straight away. So I think having sort of managing fatigue as an ongoing project, sort of tweaking, reviewing, that can be quite helpful too.
Yeah, and I think when I was talking with this physio who works with people with cancer and fatigue, there's a trajectory there, right? There's an expectation that when treatment is completed, there will be some hangover, and then eventually people will start to get their energy back, right?
There's a recovery.
Yeah, that's not us. Most of us have this chronically.
Yeah.
And, and most rare diseases are like that, where there isn't something that's going to really change happening over time. And so it's really, it's a lifetime project to figure out how to make it work for you.
Yeah. And different things might feel more palatable, or you make different choices at different points in your life. And that's okay too. You can try something once and think that's not for me, but return to it at a later point and think, actually, maybe that would be helpful for me now. So, that idea of it as an ongoing project, because I think part of what's very challenging about fatigue when you've tried to address it and perhaps nothing's really helped, that feeling that you're sort of helpless in the face of it. Yeah. And I think, that's is a very difficult feeling to live with. And sometimes just getting alongside someone else, whether that's a professional or in a support group, to say, okay, what do you do? What does help? And sort of trying to think more openly again about, are there ways that it could be dealt with just a little bit differently, that could make just a little bit of difference, perhaps?
Yeah. And I think somewhere in there is a piece about human connection that can be really transforming, because if the fatigue is causing isolation, the reconnection means at least that that your overall mental health is better. People do talk about depression going along with their fatigue, and we know that connecting is one of the tools that we have to try to manage that feeling as well.
That feels a really good point to finish today, Jess. I think leaving this podcast on the idea that human connection is what helps get us all through life's most difficult circumstances feels a really important and helpful place to end. So thank you so much for talking about your experience of fatigue, your community's experience of fatigue, and we hope that this is helpful for others out there who are living with fatigue or supporting someone else with fatigue too. We'll put some links in the podcast blurb below about coping with fatigue and also about mast cell disease more generally. And just wishing you all a very happy, hopefully restful end of the year. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in 2026. Thank you.
Thank you so much.